So good afternoon again. We are here in the closing keynote presentation, which this is, I believe, a first for us to have two keynote speakers. We are very happy to have Robin Katz here at the conference to speak about primary sources, which she is an expert in. She's an archivist and she is a librarian out in the University of California. Robin, thank you for joining us today. Take it away.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction. Hello, Galileo. I hope you are all doing well in Georgia. And thank you to Joy Woodson, Dina Anderson, and Lucy Harrison for inviting me to join you today. And thanks most of all to each of you for sticking it out to the closing keynote. I'm delighted to help you wrap up these 3 days thinking about primary sources. And I hope that by presenting some concepts and ideas around primary source literacy, I can encourage you to shift your focus from the sources themselves to the skills needed to navigate them, to inspire you to think about new ways your materials and services and your expertise can be used, and to give you some practical tools to ensure that the primary sources you all steward and make available have the most impact possible. First, we absolutely have to establish a definition of primary sources. Hopefully this conversation has come up throughout the conference already, but I find that many of us default to a disciplinary bias without realizing it. We probably tend to use primary source the way historians do. Sources from the time period being studied, things that get us as close to the events of interest as possible. Since it's not just professional or academic historians who use these kinds of historical sources, of course, it's easy to forget that the dominant understanding of primary sources is not the only one. For those working with art and literature, the primary source is, of course, the work itself, the novel, the painting, the film, making both critical analysis of the work as well as sources that contextualize history, secondary to the creative product itself. And in the sciences, well, an academic journal article can be a primary source because such reports and documentation and data from a single study or experiment is considered a primary source, contrasted with the meta-analyses or systematic reviews that look at several different studies. So acknowledging that we mostly tend to mean the history sort of primary sources, let me congratulate you all for being part of an initiative and a community that is putting primary sources online for free through the Digital Library of Georgia. Digital collections like those found in the Digital Library of Georgia benefit students and teachers of all levels, of course, scholars and researchers, sure, but also lifelong learners, citizens, and community members. By eliminating or minimizing the need to travel to do research, researchers can be more efficient with their time, face fewer physical barriers, save money, have a smaller impact on our environment, and stay safer in the midst of a global pandemic. And one of the biggest benefits of having improved access to primary sources is that they are empowering. Primary sources force us to think critically. There is no out of the box. We have to make and defend our own interpretation. This in turn helps us to create more equitable learning experiences too. From the youngest groups through graduate school, having to really think for oneself when examining and interpreting primary sources, that often levels the playing field between the most academically prepared students, which we know is usually a result of being the most advantaged students, to those who may have been under-resourced. Primary sources can also make concrete, big, abstract phenomena and events. They can make the past feel less far away, and they can humanize a curriculum. Outside of an instructional setting, free online primary sources can meet the genuine information needs of so many: property owners and renters, lawyers and activists, fans and hobbyists. The connection to place that so many of the materials in the Digital Library of Georgia provide can enhance local communities and even engage those who have ties and interests in Georgia but are physically out of state. I'm often in the position of teaching people, mostly students and instructors and researchers, but also community members, to search for primary sources online. In my unique role as a primary source literacy librarian, I get to support students and researchers with their needs, then see where they find the sources. Whereas when I was an archivist or representing one particular repository, there was always the explicit or implied goal of promoting our collections. I've since encouraged librarians and archivists and educators to adopt a primary source literacy approach, even if you have your own collections. This approach makes us much more relevant to our users. Focus less on getting your stuff out there and into their hands, and instead leverage your expertise. Of course, highlight and use your collections when you can, but use your expertise to teach people the skills that they need. When I teach people to look for primary sources online, I focus on helping them develop search terms appropriate to their topic. And I have a handy list of primary source specific terms that you can see at the provided link. And what I'm ultimately trying to get them to look for and to find is a trusted online repository or collection, somewhere they can see or listen to or otherwise directly use the primary source itself, and this is the key part, and to find a place where that source is accompanied by metadata. Because that is the real value of the Digital Library of Georgia. Look, depending on your research question, the internet is one big primary source. Blog posts and social media and websites can provide lots of information on Georgia's history, culture, and life. But what you provide is trust that the sources in the Digital Library of Georgia are as full and complete as possible, and that your descriptions of the sources, the metadata, are thorough and accurate, at least based on the information that you have. We're not perfect, of course. So you should always have a way to easily solicit feedback, evaluate the information that you're putting out there, and edit or update your metadata when something is missing, when the identifications are wrong, or when the way things are described contributes to systematic oppression. I know that as part of Georgia Archives Month last year, the Digital Library of Georgia had Betts Coop speak about reparative description, and there is actually a workshop coming up about reparative description in archival processing and cataloging from the Society of Georgia Archivists on June 23rd. So I hope that these ideas are being actively discussed and experimented with and implemented throughout your workplaces. Inaccurate, incomplete, or harmful metadata is not the only challenge researchers face when working with primary sources online. Try to take the user's perspective. Do you know how people find your collections and use them, as opposed to how we think about, organize, and present our collections? DACS compliant collection names are not always meaningful or intuitive to researchers. Many users do not understand the hierarchy of item to collection, or the difference between a finding aid and that describes physical boxes and a set of digitized materials and an online exhibit. These kinds of nuanced skills, as well as much more obvious to us basic skills, are articulated in the guidelines for primary source literacy, which were adopted in 2018 by both national organizations for special collections librarians and archivists. The Rare Book and Manuscript section, which is part of the Association of College and Research Libraries, and the Society of American Archivists. If you work in any way with primary sources, even if you are not primarily responsible for instruction or education, and you're not already familiar with this document, I would recommend spending some time with it to see how it might impact what you do. Now, if you're coming from the academic libraries, instruction world, you may say, but we already have the framework for information literacy from ACRL. And trust me, there was one point in the process of writing the guidelines where I said to my fellow members of the Joint Task Force, you know, the framework covers primary sources too. Maybe we don't need anything separate. But the truth is that there are skills that are incredibly specific to working with primary sources, just like how there are standards for visual literacy. And yes, those apply to many primary sources as well. Of course, in Georgia, if anyone is trying to reach or support K-12 audiences, the Georgia Standards of Excellence are going to be absolutely key as well. I really love how this site makes life easy on K-12 educators looking for grade level appropriate, standards aligned activities on various curricular topics. It's really one of the better landing pages and collections of resources like this that I've seen a digital library provide. But the social studies teaching units of the GSE are a content standard. They cover the topics that primary sources may document. My goal today is to get you to use this idea of primary source literacy to focus more on skills and abilities than just subject matter, to apply your collections and your services and yourselves in new ways that have meaningful impact on your audiences. The guidelines breaks down the idea of primary source literacy into concepts and skills in these 5 main areas. I've linked out to a short, colorful, one-page PDF that I made that concisely summarizes the 22 learning objectives listed across these different areas. And I'm going to show some examples from the Digital Library of Georgia that illuminate some of these learning objectives. So let's start with 1A. A person knowledgeable in the use of primary sources can distinguish primary from secondary sources for a given research question. Now, if you were a biographer writing about Harriet Powers, or even a middle school student doing a National History Day project on her, the only surviving photograph of one of the finest 19th century quilt makers would be considered a primary source. And most of us are probably used to thinking about the value of our collections in this kind of content-driven way. But the guidelines can help us conceive of using this same photograph to illuminate the fact that, in contrast, art historians would only consider Harriet Powers' quilts to be primary sources. For them, historical and biographical sources like this are still extremely valuable, but they are not primary. One could design an activity, in person or online, where students match this photograph to one of 2 research questions for which it would be considered a primary source. Or perhaps students are given a sample research question and asked to identify whether various sources, such as the photograph, this quilt, or this open access scholarly journal article would be considered primary or secondary. Or let's look at objective 1C. A person knowledgeable in the use of primary sources can draw on primary sources to generate and refine research questions. Imagine giving students a single source, a suite of materials, or a whole collection, and see if they can come up with fitting research questions. I found the corporate photos from the Lane Brothers collection at the University of Georgia especially rich. Looking at just 2 examples from the Trust Company subseries could pique a student's interest in banking, urban development, employment, foodways, office technology, and more. Sometimes primary sources raise more questions than they answer, and this objective reminds us that our collections can be both starting points for research as well as the answer to someone looking for something. For those of you who do outreach, take a look at objective 2A. A person knowledgeable in the use of primary sources can identify the possible locations of primary sources. What could you do so that students in Georgia would list the Digital Library of Georgia or your home institution as one of those possible places? In what context might they be asked to name these different locations? And how could you find out if you were on their radar? Now, the platform or the repository itself might be the teaching tool, as with objective 2B. A person knowledgeable in the use of primary sources can use appropriate, efficient, and effective search strategies in order to locate primary sources. Can you clearly articulate what an efficient and effective search in the Digital Library of Georgia looks like? Is there a shared understanding of this by the people who design the interface and the folks creating metadata and those of us who use the resource to teach? Objective 2C states that a person knowledgeable in the use of primary sources knows the difference between descriptions about sources that are found online versus those that contain digital versions. There is a link from the Digital Library of Georgia metadata to the archive space finding aid labeled original collection for this really interesting pro-life newsletter collection. And that's true, right? This is the original collection, is that physical archival collection. But that label original collection may not be self-explanatory to most users. And is often the case, there is not a link from the folder or item in the finding aid back to the digital object. nor is there a link at the collection level to the Digital Library of Georgia. Through interface design or instruction, how can you better help users understand both the connections and the differences between these two things? I often think that something as simple as a note in the header or footer of our finding aid databases could help explain what a finding aid is, and that might do wonders. You could task students with finding the finding aid or the digital collection and explaining the difference in their own words as well. Now, for those of you who do use primary sources to support teaching and learning, you are probably focusing the most on objectives 3A and 3B. Reading, examining, summarizing primary sources, making that subject or topical connection. Here's an example of how certain sources, like this galley proof, can be used to understand processes, regardless of what the text is about. Can you think of other collection items that pair well with objective 3C? A person knowledgeable in the use of primary sources understands that a primary source may exist in a variety of iterations, including excerpts, transcriptions, and translations, due to publication, copying, and other transformations. Now, I'm going to go a little out of order here and quickly cover the fact that functions like the citation generator in the Digital Library of Georgia and the simple, catchy graphics, like the ones used for your rights statements, are a great way to help audiences learn to use and incorporate primary sources appropriately. Now, the reason I switched up the order is that some of the most engaging, timely, and relevant questions about primary sources are raised in section 4 of the guidelines. There are objectives on critically evaluating perspectives, recognizing tone and bias, understanding gaps and archival silences, interrogating power dynamics, and demonstrating historical empathy. I was pleased to see that one of the publicly stated goals of the Digital Library of Georgia is to build comprehensive digital collections that reflect the full wealth of Georgia's history and culture and ensure fair representation of traditionally underrepresented groups. I was really impressed by the harmful content warning on the footer and linked out to a broader statement of the site. And I hope that throughout the course of this conference, you have had the opportunity to connect with each other about how work like this has impacted the way your collections are used, what skills are being developed as a result, and the impact that this growth and learning will have on your communities. I hope that the guidelines for primary source literacy will give all of you, no matter your role and relation to primary sources, a shared vocabulary for the knowledge, skills, and abilities that your collections can help to build. I hope you see the richness in each one of the 22 learning objectives included, and that helps you to focus and to go deep. If you're teaching an instruction session, just one learning objective is more than enough to try to cover. The ideas and concepts in the guidelines can help you to advocate for resources, for time, for budget lines, for grant funds, to support programs, staff, and products. You might create more ready-to-go curricula, lesson plans, or teachers' kits, centered not just on specific subjects or topics, but on skills and abilities as well. You might use the guidelines to collaborate with instructors who want to design a learning experience with you, an assignment, a session, an online tutorial. If you plan your own instructions or lead tours or public programs or answer reference questions or host interns or mentor early career professionals, take a look at the guidelines. When writing collection development policies, appraising collection offers, acquiring new materials, and building digital collections, consider how skills can be centered in your work, and assess whether the design and delivery of your collections best supports users in the skills outlined by the guidelines. But I have to say that the guidelines are a foundation that lead to much more specific intentional planning. The guidelines are an excellent starting point for backward design, a process in which you first identify the end goals and then, as the name implies, work backwards to make sure you get where you want to be going. In instructional or pedagogical design, that means not starting with the subject coverage or even the in-class activities. The seminal text on this is Understanding by Design, and it is worth a skim by anyone doing any sort of teaching. The main concept is that if you first establish the skills you want students to leave with, then you have to define how you will know they've actually acquired those skills. What is your criteria for success? You design a roadmap that you think will work, and if your checks along the way show that students are not getting there, you adapt and change course, but you keep the destination, that end goal, the same. It's about results and impact. With the guidelines, the big picture goals are provided through those 22 learning objectives. The practical next steps for primary source instruction are to turn those vague ideas into specific measurable learning outcomes that include the criteria for success within the given setting of the real learning experience. And that's why I wrote a practical handbook that provides ready-to-use measurable learning outcomes connected to each of the learning objectives in the guidelines. It should be coming out within the year from SAA Publishing, but I will preview for you today the process by which we can turn all of those broad objectives we just covered and turn them into something measurable and specific. If we, for example, take guidelines objective 2B, a person knowledgeable in the use of primary sources is familiar with the most common ways primary sources are described, such as catalog records and archival finding aids. The book provides an adapted, measurable learning outcome. Students will be able to match the filters used in a specific platform to correct definitions. The underlined parts are what need to be customized. So here in Georgia, you would of course customize the platform to be the Digital Library of Georgia. And you'd have to reflect on which of the filters shown on the right are the most important and useful to really knowing how to successfully search and navigate the Digital Library of Georgia. What is the difference between subject and topics, or location and county, or medium and type? Is it important to highlight the holding institution, since visitors who land on the site may not understand that the Digital Library of Georgia aggregates content from multiple institutions? This outcome is easily quantified and scored, and I would expect a successful student to get 4 out of 5 correct. So the final measurable learning outcome is, at the end of the library session, students will be able to correctly match 4 out of 5 filters used in the Digital Library of Georgia to their correct definitions. Only then do you design the session or activity where students learn what they need to learn in order to be able to complete this assessment. Whether in person or on Zoom, you'd probably plan for some combination of didactic instruction, talking at people through demonstrations or a mini lecture, and active learning, letting students try it out for themselves. Show, don't tell, help them discover, regroup and summarize. Then you would administer an assessment. You can use any online forms such as Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, Typeform, Poll Everywhere, or if you have it, a learning management system like Moodle, Canvas, or Blackboard. Note that a score on this assessment does not have to correspond to an evaluation, meaning students can complete my quiz in a library session without it having anything to do with their class grade or participation points. The data collected here is really just for you and the students to know how they're doing and to reassess the activity or lesson if a substantial number of people are falling short. If you can do a check for understanding midway through, you could also adjust your methods to try to better reach the goal. And in some cases, you might even measure pre and post to demonstrate your impact on building knowledge, skills, and attitudes as well. Now, not every learning outcome is so easily quantified, but that doesn't mean that more complex outcomes cannot still be measured. The book walks through strategies for assessing learning in these cases with tools like a single point rubric. If you are out there using huge rubrics that look like tax code or actuarial tables that make even your eyes glaze over as you're using them, I highly recommend switching to the more flexible and meaningful single point rubric, which allows you to highlight exactly where a student needs to improve and lets you celebrate what a student did well without trying to jam a lot of feedback into rote and restrictive categories. For those of you who can't wait to dig more into primary source literacy and who will be impatiently awaiting publication of 410 measurable learning outcomes, these are my top 5 suggestions for where a wide range of cultural heritage professionals and educators can invest in and develop primary source pedagogy and instruction skills. My favorite practical handbook by far is Using Primary Sources. So if your library doesn't have it already, order it. I tend to think our professional literature on this subject leans too heavily on case studies, which is why in my book, I try to distill the most actionable and useful tidbits from that mass of published case studies for you. But the open access peer-reviewed case studies in the SAA Teaching with Primary Sources series are a good place to start. They map to the guidelines, though not always perfectly, and there are some really shining examples of good teaching in there. There is a thriving Teaching with Primary Sources community in Georgia and elsewhere, and the Teaching with Primary Sources, or TPS Collective, offers many different channels for connecting with a diverse and active group of librarians, archivists, and educators who tend to be really generous and energetic. This group plans regular unconferences that are free and not to be missed, so mark August 2nd to 4th on your calendars for TPS Fest 2022. And I will be teaching my online asynchronous Library Juice Academy course on primary source literacy again in the month of October. So I'll leave you with the suggestion that you use the guidelines, but keep it simple. Ask for resources to do this work and use the guidelines and your own findings to explain why it's valuable. Make and share concrete products, collaborate with each other and with your key audiences. Try new things, put more collections online, and enhance the ones that are already there. And don't forget that primary sources are not just in your libraries and archives and museums. They're not just in Galileo and the Digital Library of Georgia. If you're taking the idea of primary source literacy to heart, it's not ultimately about you or your institution. Primary sources can be found and compiled in our own homes, among our families, in circulating collections, all over the internet, in the built environment, and in our neighborhoods. Libraries can promote, compile, leverage, or encourage communities to value those sources as well in order to develop valuable skills and ultimately to make meaning. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Robin, for that presentation. Are there any questions from any of the folks in the virtual audience? You can type them in chat. Let me go ahead and unmute. Let everyone unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask Robin any questions about either her forthcoming book or any of the topics that she mentioned, any ideas you may have about the use of primary sources and what you do. We have a good amount of time here. So let's see if anyone chimes in. Well, I see one question from Adam.
Yeah, I see a question from Adam. Thank you. Would you try to combine information literacy, visual literacy, and primary sources in one session or several for classrooms? So these are intersecting concepts, right? Like if you're using a primary source that is visual, you could certainly explain what you're doing through those different guidelines or frameworks. But the idea is in any given single session, if you have 50 minutes with some college first years, if you have one period in a high school, if you're just having a single public event, generally less is more. That's true of the amount of collections that you put in front of people. And that's true of the broad objectives and the specific measurable learning outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So really, it's kind of like packing a suitcase, you know, put everything you want to take on the bed and then maybe cut it in half. So definitely less is more, try to keep it simple. But that's not to say that, of course, some of those concepts aren't intersecting when a primary source is also visual, is also fulfilling, you know, one of the information needs in terms of information literacy. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great, thank you. Are there any other questions from you all before we close out the conference today? Let's see. Well, not seeing any.
I would also love to hear any examples of some of the work or ideas that y'all are working on in Georgia. If anyone wants to share for the group, anything that you're doing that you think relates to some of these topics.
Well, I think everyone is ready for the weekend.
Ready to call it quits.
But I'll turn on my camera since this is the last of our sessions. I did want to definitely thank Robin again for bringing this closing keynote presentation to us to sort of bring it all home. Our theme this year was around our tagline, Imagine, Discover, Explore, but with a focus on primary sources. And so we are very grateful that she was able to be with us in spite of the 3-hour time difference that there is between here and California. And then for everyone else, I just want to thank you all for attending the conference, the virtual conference. Maybe next year we might be back in person. Who knows? Look for a survey to that end. We'd love to get your feedback on how you'd like the conference to be next year. So thank you all for attending the conference this year, and hope you all have a great rest of the day and a great weekend. Bye.